I've been asked before if you need to play video games to work in video games. The short answer to this question is no. There are lots of jobs in video games that require you to execute to other people's vision. In those cases, it is perfectly realistic for you to work in video games and never having played a video game and not really being interested in video games as a medium at all. But I don't really think that's the question that's being asked. I think the question more is, in those more creative areas, do you have to play video games? And there the answer is a little bit more complicated. I will give you two answers. One is a yes with a but, and the other is a no with an if. Yes with a but. If you are making video games, in most cases, it's really important for you to understand the medium, especially within the genre that you're working. But there is a huge risk that in an effort to be well informed, you can fall into what is often called last game-itis, meaning that you are overly influenced by the last game that you played. This is why you often see these weird echoes in game design, where a game will come out that does something new and interesting, and then subsequent games will copy that because their design staff, their production staff, their leadership played that game and then fell into last game-itis and felt the need to copy that feature into their own game. I guess a second but is that you have to be careful not to sand all the edges off of your own creativity, off of your own uniqueness, as you are learning from the games and genres around you. I think one of the things that we're seeing in AAA right now, because AAA is and has always been highly risk adverse, is a certain degree of sameness across games. Because in an effort to avoid risk, games are copying each other. They're moving towards a common center. They're blending everything together into something that they understand to be palatable, to be acceptable to the average member of the game playing public. The problem that can arise from this is if you blend too strongly, if you only set palatable as your measurement of success, what you can end up with is something that is uninspiring. Oatmeal is palatable, but it isn't exciting. It doesn't engage beyond that base level nutritional fulfillment. When we are playing other games, we can learn things. We can come to understand the conventions of our genre. We can learn ways to do things better. But what we have to be careful of is to not sand away what makes us unique, sand away the things that make us stand out from the other games, and end up with entire genres that all end up looking exactly the same. My no with an if goes a little bit differently. You can make games as someone who doesn't play games. We see interesting explorations of different genres, different ways of telling story from people who don't bring in as much baggage from the rest of games as a medium. In visual arts, these are often called outside artists, people who exist outside of the traditions of the space. And this can happen in video games as well. If you are someone who is going to do that, what you need to be aware of is that you aren't necessarily aware of the genre conventions, of the expectations of the spaces that you are working in. And this can work to your benefit because you're not carrying that baggage and it lets you explore different spaces. But it also means that you might end up adopting a control scheme that was tried and moved away from by the broader game making community a while ago, and potentially for good reasons. It means that you could present the player with things that are off-putting to them as they come to your game with a broader understanding than you have. Sometimes that's amazing. Sometimes that lets you explore spaces that are otherwise untouched. But often it can lead to confusion, to a loss of engagement from the players you're trying to attract. Certainly in the early days of me as a game developer, I played games, but the games that I played were almost exclusively top-down strategy and click-based PC games. I had virtually no experience with console games, and I had minimal experiences even with things like first-person shooters. I remember playing Oblivion, and in my first engagement with that game, bouncing off of the WASD controls for controlling the player, which is, in retrospect, kind of hilarious because that was a standard control scheme within the first-person shooter space. But the games that I played, the games that I developed, were almost exclusively point-and-click, mouse-driven experiences. Did this mean that the games that I worked on, Baldur's Gate 1, Baldur's Gate 2, Neverwinter, were able to do things that they wouldn't have otherwise been able to do if they had gone with a more standard first-person shooter kind of control? Sure, maybe. Arguably, Mass Effect 1 is a third-person cover shooter built by a team that didn't really understand that space. Mass Effect 1's combat, pretty clunky, but it also allowed an entirely new setting, an entirely new RPG space to be explored. Whereas if they had started with more familiarity with that space, the game could have ended up being more like the action shooters of the time as opposed to a well-grounded RPG attempting to have more action cover shooter kind of elements. So do you have to play games to be a game developer? Yes, if you are wanting to work in the mainstream spaces, if you're wanting to be making design decisions, if you are wanting to have creative input into the way the game development goes. But if you are doing that, don't allow yourselves to fall into overusing, overwearing features and conventions. If you want to be less mainstream, if you want to be different, then there is opportunity for game developers who don't play games, who explore the medium as an outsider. But those games are going to tend to be more niche. A special thanks to my members. They provide the resources that this channel needs to keep running. If you're interested in becoming a member, there's a link to that down in the description. We also have a Patreon if you're interested in supporting the channel that way. Both channel members and patrons get access to our Discord server, which is a great way to interact with our community if you want to do that to a deeper level. Have you ever played a game that came out of left field, that did something that was almost antithetical to the way other games are developed? Do you know if that developer was someone who played a lot of games? Maybe they were an outsider like I am discussing. Throw an interesting indie game you played recently down in the comments, very relevant to this topic. I will see you again soon. Thank you.